And thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have, I think, a really mixed audience, just looking at a few of the people who've joined in today. So people from around the UK as well as the Open University. And this has been a very collaborative project, and so that's a really good thing to see. Oh, and someone else joining even now. So yeah, Neil, if you could move us on to the next slide. Apologies for the long title of the talk as well, but I think it does kind of reflect the sense that we're bringing together a few different things here in an interesting kind of configuration. So yeah, hopefully that will become clearer as we go on. So what we're going to talk about today, we'll start off with the kind of context and objectives of this project, which was a knowledge transfer voucher project. So in a sense, it's about working in collaboration, sharing what we know, and Neil and NatSpec and Techability sharing what they know and kind of coming to some shared objectives. So Neil will introduce NatSpec, Techability and the Techability Standards. We'll talk a bit about the design and implementation of a prototype. So Richard will lead us through that, and the objective there to be able to generate these kind of tailored reports and recommendations. And then we'll go through some evaluation of that and some feedback we've received, and then have a discussion of the opportunities we see for these kind of tools, and where they fit into processes, but also really open to others' views on this space and what's possible with it. So yeah, next slide, please. So to start us off, the kind of challenge that we're interested here, and as I say, this is very much sort of a joint interest, is that assistive technologies can make a huge difference in enabling study for people with learning difficulties and disabilities. I mean, we're very aware of that at the Open University in terms of how we support our own students and a large population of students declaring disabilities and getting support in various ways with that, but also looking at how we make things more accessible by design. So the role of assistive technologies is there. It's very clear that, like any area of technology, that's changing over time, and also that it requires quite a lot of expertise and awareness to understand it. And that in itself is an issue. So education institutions struggle both with the kind of strategy and the use of assistive technologies. So they're not really necessarily well placed to think about how best to use it, how best to introduce it or support students with it, but also this changing landscape of technologies as well. So as we've said, expertise is potentially limited, and the technology changes quickly as well. And this is true in a sense across the sector. And I won't go into too much detail on that because I know Neil will talk about his perspective there. But yeah, next slide, please. So as I said, this is a knowledge transfer project, and in a sense, it's an opportunity where you've got two organizations and groups of people who have a sort of shared interest, but also different perspectives and different expertise to bring to it. So in terms of Techability, and again, I won't go into too much detail here because Neil will illustrate this and explain it in more detail. But the Techability Standards are an initiative that is aimed at tackling this challenge of enhancing awareness, assessing quality in the assistive technology provision of colleges and in educational institutions. And that they've got guidance on these standards. So, quite a lot of work's going into producing the standards, the criteria and the guidance around them. And when we started this project, Neil had just been working on producing a form, in a sense, of way for people to work through and answer questions about how or if they were meeting the criteria in the standards. So that was, is an interesting resource for us in this project. And then I think the third point is that Techability run a champions network. So they have these connections into colleges all over the UK. and some of the members are here today joining us, and that's really great to see. So that in itself is powerful, because obviously you've got a lot of potential perspectives and people you can ask about what they'd like to see. And then, yeah, next slide. So just from the Open University point of view, we've been working for a while now on research looking at how we support our students to kind of declare disabilities, gather information about support, and again, think about that from the student's perspective. But something that's come out repeatedly during the time that we've worked on this, and particularly last year, we were running some workshops exploring what would be useful as a kind of digital access advisor, as a system that would help students directly. A thing that's kind of repeatedly come up is, well, what about staff? How would you support staff to understand how to have better practices around supporting their students, whether that's in terms of academic staff and educators and how they teach, or whether that's in terms of support staff or digital accessibility, all sorts of areas. So really this question kept coming up of, okay, well, we can imagine putting advisor in front of students. What's the sort of staff facing side of that? So that was already there, and then the discussions kind of led on from that, and we started talking to Neil and Phil at NatSpec, and as I say, that led us into this project and the proposal. So that's kind of where we got to. So yeah, I think, where are we next? Okay, so yeah, the objectives of the project. As I say, we've got the Techability Standards. There's a lot of guidance there, and that's essentially a knowledge base that we can use, take on board, and develop a system around that. So using GPT and the kind of large language model systems to develop a prototype that creates this tailored guidance. So as I mentioned before, there's also a kind of questionnaire audit that individuals can use to think about, where are they with their college, with their own work in terms of assisted technology provision. So we've got these two resources. We've got the information about the Techability Standards and this form. And the idea, was to create a prototype that we could then show to the Champions Network, and that would then produce tailored guidance. So they complete this form, and the output of that is then a report which is specific to them and their college, giving recommendations about how they would improve their strategies and use of assistive technology. And obviously, as I said, having the champions involved is great, because we've then been able to gather feedback and think about the potential for these systems, both from the perspective of techability in that spec, but also as a wider interest in what can we do with these sorts of systems to help provide tailored guidance to people. Okay. Yeah, passing over to Neil now.
Great, thanks, Tim. It's bringing me back actually to when we first were talking about this, and I remember mentioning to Tim that we had a set of standards and we wanted to develop them, and asked if there were any ways we could collaborate on that and think about it. And Tim said he'd go away and think about it, and he did one step better and came back and said, we've just passed a kind of soft deadline, but we might be able to get in on an extension for this. So very much opportunistic how we started off with this. I'm just going to run through just who we are and just some background, just so you know who we are and what the elements are that we're talking about with this project. So NatSpec, we're the membership association for organisations that offer specialist further education and training for students with learning difficulties and disabilities aged 16 to 25. However, we don't just work within the specialist college sector. We also support mainstream colleges with their students with disabilities as well. And on the right hand side there, there's a picture of our CEO and some of the NatSpec college students. They're at our manifesto launch in Westminster, as we're always trying to lobby and change things to improve things for students with disabilities. And Techability is a service within NatSpec. So we specifically focus on the assistive technology side of things, and we do that through webinars, consultations. We run a yearly conference that's coming up in November. We run training sessions. We've created a set of standards, as we'll be talking about today. We carry out lobbying and advocacy. We create resources, carry out student assessments, and we also run the Champions program. So the purpose of the Techability Standards was just being aware that as professionals, if there's one or two of us working for Techability, there's only so much we can do if we're very hands-on and think that we can change everything ourselves. What we wanted to do was take the knowledge that we had and that other professionals had and put it in the hands of people working with students. So that's where the Techability Standards came from. We wanted something that was visually engaging, simple, and linked people so they would know where to go to find out more. So it's about knowing what excellent looks like in terms of assistive technology practice. There's a lot of focus on getting ready for inspection, whether that's CQC or Ofsted, and it means that you've got something to show in terms of this is where we are with assistive technology, and this is where we'd like to be, this is what we're developing, that kind of thing. And I've got the source there to the Techability Standards. So what I can actually just do is probably pop that in the chat there. And you can all have access to that as well. So back to the slides. So the just as some examples, I just chose some of the most popular ones. They're around learners being assessed for their technology access needs. It's around having staff who have specific training on supporting AT usage. It's about staff having support networks to improve their knowledge and troubleshoot issues. And also learners having access to devices that take into account their access needs. We're also thinking about learners having a transition plan, making sure that that includes a handover to professionals or other parties who are going to support them in the future. So thinking of going on to college or onto workplaces. Want to make sure that all the learning materials are accessible by design and provided digitally. And learners can customize their desktop accessibility options if they're on a laptop or computer using user experience virtualization, which means that their settings follow them around. I created a Google form, which I think I just created it as a proof of concept, thinking, oh, we'll use it a few times and then we'll move on and we'll do something else. And we've been using it ever since. So part of the project, we will talk about how we're going to move on from that. But it was just a quick and easy kind of transfer of the Techability Standards being turned into something that could be used as a self-audit for specialist colleges and Carlton centres. And those that tried it, the feedback was positive. It takes quite a long time to go through. There's 12 different topics and multiple questions on all the topics. So you do need a bit of time to fill it out, but it does leave you with a fairly comprehensive output in terms of knowing where you are with assistive technology. The champions, we have many today. So hello champions, and thanks for joining us. Every NatSpec college and every Carlton centre can put forward a professional to be a champion, and how they benefit and use the support depends on their context. The colleges and the centres are very different, but we offer consistent and regular interventions. So the idea there is bi-monthly meetings where we share best practice, welcome guest speakers, share updates on assistive technology. We give access to newly developed support materials. So recently I've been doing something on mobile phone apps, and I just made sure that as soon as we've got that ready, we're sharing it with the champions. Accessing a forum to make sure that the champions can support each other. We link with technology suppliers, getting them to come in and talk, and then having a future contact for them, so that we are that kind of broker really to make sure that they can get in touch with each other, and becoming part of a community. And that's been one of the most pleasurable bits really, is seeing the champions supporting each other, and sharing what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. I do say that every year that I'm out of a specialist college, I start to lose that up-to-date daily practice. So to make sure that we cover that as Techability, the champions are essential really to make sure that we're sharing the best and most up-to-date knowledge, and collaboration opportunities on projects such as the one that we're talking about today. Okay, so I think I'm handing over to Richard now, aren't I?
Yes, thanks, Neil. Right. Okay, so for the technical solution, there was a couple of goals that we needed for this. One was obviously to assess the an institution in question against the Techability Standards, and then as a follow-on from that, obviously to then produce some sort of report for them with guidance and recommended actions that they could take away. Next slide, please, Neil. So initially, there was a couple of approaches we considered, either going with the questionnaire that Neil had already produced, or else actually looking at a more custom GPT assistant that could maybe have a conversation with the person from the institution, and through that conversation sort of ask delving questions and then end up coming up with recommendations that it would give them. The assistant didn't live up to what we hoped it might, and wasn't able to participate in a conversation at that level with the delving questions that we're hoping for, and it would sort of always jump to trying to give recommendations far too early. That, and then also the feedback from the Champions Network that they'd actually prefer the questionnaire, led us to opt for going with the questionnaire. So next slide, please, Neil. So taking the questionnaire, there was a couple of processes that we had to then come up with to end up with a final report. So the first thing that we did was produce sort of like a recommendation store locally, and the way we did that was by taking the content from the Techability website to produce a knowledge base, which we then used as part of an AI assistant. So the way we did that, we actually used AI to produce the final document, the final knowledge base document. So this consisted of the system that we'd created, crawled the Techability website, and then from the raw HTML that we stored from that, we then used AI to convert that raw HTML into Markdown, which is sort of a much lighter weight form of marking up documents. From that Markdown, we condensed that all into one document, which became the knowledge base. And that knowledge base was then, so then we created an OpenAI assistant, which you then link this knowledge base to. This OpenAI assistant had instructions to generate a recommendation given a question from the questionnaire. So then what we did, again, in our system, we looped through all the questions from the questionnaire, and for each question, we sent it off to this assistant. The assistant generated the recommendation, which it returned to us. And then in turn, all those recommendations we stored locally. So next slide, please, Neil. So that was the generation of the recommendations, and then the next process was about using those recommendations to generate a sort of a custom report for people that had used the questionnaire. So as Neil said, the questionnaire was created in Google Forms, and the way that you can store the responses from the questionnaires is in Google Sheets. So then from Google Sheets, Google provides an API that you can access for them. So again, our system used that API to find new responses. So when someone had completed the questionnaire, we'd get that through the API. From those responses, we would then look for answers that we needed, that we decided a recommendation would be needed for. So then we'd combine all those recommendations and then again use AI to take all those recommendations to create a summary of them. And then the combination of the recommendations themselves and the summary, again, the system then took both of those, created a Word document, and then emailed the Techability team. And this sort of allowed them to, have a final check of the questionnaire, the report prior to sending on to the institute. So next slide, please. So that was what we developed. I think reflections on that are that the way we consumed the content from the website in producing the markdown seemed to work very well to create a knowledge base from. And we've actually gone on to use that same sort of technique in another project. I think what I would say is that the use of AI to generate that markdown isn't always best. Maybe I think what we found from it was it was good. It was a good general approach because you could sort of essentially give it any website and ask it to do that. Whereas the problem is if it's a very large website, let's say, there's a time cost for that, and also it costs money to use OpenAI. So on the other project we did this with, we actually created a custom algorithm that directly converted the HTML to Markdown. The other two things that we found were both around sort of the curation of content that the AI generated. So in both storing the recommendations and then emailing the report, these were both sort of methods that we found to be able to review and potentially edit any of the content that the AI generated prior to giving that to the final user, the final consumer of it. And I think the takeaway really for that is to not be, AI does have the ability to hallucinate, and you can't always. Most of the time, what it will produce is what you want. In this case. But occasionally it may come up with something that's just not right, and you do need those human eyes on it to check for that sort of thing. Yeah, so that's it for me. I think it's back over to Neil now.
Great, thanks, Richard. Richard, can I just check for Markdown? If I remember correctly, it's taking all the language off the website and putting it into a concise, kind of easily readable form. Is that right?
Yeah. So So the sort of the raw HTML obviously has everything in it that tells a web page how to be displayed, what it looks like and everything, as well as the content the user will read. And so the content that we took out of the HTML was basically the content that a user would be seeing, that they'd be reading on the web page. And so storing it in Markdown was a way of condensing all of that just to be that information. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Richard. And
okay.
I think what I enjoyed is just kind of looking back at how complicated some of these systems might seem to us. The front end just involved the champion filling out the Google form just the same as they would do otherwise. So the complexity was all at the back end, wasn't it, where we were developing it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Richard. So just to give you an idea of the timeline of this, we started in September with an initial project proposal meeting. We created an online area. We made sure that we had an early questionnaire sent just a month later with the Techability champions to make sure that we could understand what they wanted from a tool. We had an update and a workshop for the Assistive Technology Network, which is a network of assistive technologists across the UK, run between ourselves, Techability, and JISC as well. And I think we've got Kelly here today, so hi Kelly. And in March, we had an update and engagement meeting where we had some forms ready to show to the champions, some of the initial output. It was at that point, it was a body of text effectively without formatting. So we had a bit of time to come back and reformat and then show it again to the Techability champions. And right the way till today, our dissemination event. So just going back to that engagement with the champions, we made sure that we engaged with the champions for initial input to get usage and feedback of the prototype approach. And in order to do this, we had 9 colleges that filled out the full Google form, 2 additional colleges that just filled out selected sections of the Google form, and 3 of these colleges, it was actually part of a training. We were delivering some training around assessment and the different stages at college and how you support students. And as part of it, I said, it might be good for you to fill out the standards, and then you can also have, after this training, just a little bit of feedback of how assistive technology is around assessment at your college. So we could send a custom report based on that. So at that initial feedback meeting, that initial feedback that we sent out, it came back that all 7 were aware of the Techability Standards. 5 had used it, 2 hadn't. The use had been different, and some of them used it as a kind of audit tool. Some of them used it as a starting point for improving their AT provision, and someone used it as a kind of self-assessment of their own provision, as an individual for them to look into it. And a baseline. So it was used in different ways, but following the same kind of pattern. We asked how useful would it be to have a tool that could guide you through the standards, and fortunately it came out good with an average of 9.5. I think we'd have been pretty disappointed if we were receiving low numbers at that point. And we asked whether we'd want it as a survey, based on which is similar to the Google Forms, or a conversation with a bot. So there was either equally preferable was the #1 choice, and then it just came out on the side of preferring the survey in the end with 2. We just checked that the initial kind of main standards that I thought that I'd mentioned earlier were relevant and that we were focusing on the right things. And this was in case we made it modular and we decided to cut down the standards. Unfortunately, we had good feedback from that, with everyone saying they're either relevant or very relevant, apart from just one standard, with one person who said it was not particularly relevant. And we asked what would be the best length for the report, and I assumed it would be less than 5 pages and people would want something concise, but actually people were fine with a very detailed report. So that was interesting feedback. But I think what's interesting from this as well is that there's a range. So there's people that do want less than 5 pages, and there are people who do want 10 to 20 pages. We asked, should the report be modular? I quite like this idea because it meant that colleges could get a report back, work on it, and then come back and do another module, rather than having an all-encompassing large report and then having lots and lots of work to do that might be a little bit overwhelming. So no one said no. We had 3 for yes and 5 unsure. And we asked, what would you change about the tool? And we had some interesting feedback of they'd like to see the report, but the process looks great. Great tool. Breaking it into chunks, it seemed useful. So we made sure that we went back and reformatted. And not being tied into using Google Docs was some feedback, and they're not the only ones that raised that as well. So it is possible to do it with different form tools. And having an overall short report at the beginning of the document, which is a great idea. So we made sure to bring in that executive summary afterwards. Myself and Phil sat down and we found that the report had successfully created detailed recommendations. It was well laid out. The accessibility checker had come up with very little to change. This was the second iteration, so we'd gone back with some accessibility recommendations, and Richard had worked on them and created something that was an accessible document, which was great. It was also well laid out, and we added in that executive summary at the start of the document. The feedback that we thought maybe that we should explain how the document is generated, the limitations of the tool, the responsibilities of the author and the reader of the report. We think that's something unique to AI, really, that we have to start thinking about things like that. We decided the report should probably be shorter. Certain points had been expanded much more than we'd expect. And it would also be great if participants could select the level of detail that they wanted at the start. I thought that would be useful. There were three kind of incidents, and one of them showed that the tool had struggled. Another showed that it had actually gone further than we thought it would. And the third one showed up our source material, really. So the first one here is it gave two recommendations that appeared contradictory in terms of when you're assessing a student. Do you want to choose a space that's quiet and free from distractions, or to conduct it where the learners will be using the technology? And we could understand why it made that mistake, because it is good to have an initial space to assess learners, but the ongoing process of assessing a learner means it's also good practice to assess them in the context of where they'll use the technology. So in this instance, it lost the nuance a little bit of the recommendation, showing that you do need some kind of human checking of the recommendations. For the second one, the second example that I picked out, it pulled out that you could collect feedback from learners post-assessment to refine and improve the appropriateness of the environments used. So essentially just saying that you ask the student, was this environment, did this work for you? And this isn't from the original standards, but it seems like good practice. So it's an example of the tool going further than the source material involved. And the third example was around assessing learner needs for accessible document formats. And it took on an individual approach to accessible documents, which isn't really good practice. So the reality is that it should be an organizational approach to making documents accessible as a standard, with adaptations for individuals where they need them. But we read back through the initial text that we'd got on the standard, and we realized that we hadn't made that clear enough. So it was also a good way of us checking our source material. So we've got some ideas of what we'd like to do next after that feedback. We'd like to update the Techability Standards ourselves, so that we can update and make sure that the source material is better. We'd like to update and make some improvements to the tool. We'd like to integrate the tool into wider support within Techability. We'd like to look at wider application of the tool into different areas, and also an application of the techniques used today for other areas. So just to go into further detail on that, the update to the Techability Standards, we're planning for this summer, and it will be us that are producing an updated version of the Techability Standards. We'll invite the wider assistive technology community to look through those, including Techability Champions, Assistive Technology Network, and whoever else is interested. And we'll produce a final draft based on that feedback, and set further review points in time. And it's good to have these updates. I think we'll need to run these fairly regularly because of the changes in delivery, in technology, in adoption of mainstream accessibility tools, and introduction of AI as well. And doing that will improve the quality of the output from the tool as well. So it'll be a useful step to take. We've got some specific updates and improvements we think we could make to the tool itself. So we could create a core set of standards for an initial tool. So for those that don't have maybe the buy-in that are initially doing this, to have just a kind of 7 to 8 initial standards and just get a very short report might be quite useful. We want to make the tool modular, as mentioned before. We'd like to add organizational context to the tool and consider how that might affect the output. So different expectations from a small vocational college to a large academic-based college, for example. And we'd like to consider input from professionals and the organisation involved as well. So having some space to have that feedback. So this is what we recommend. What do you think about that? And integrating the tool into wider support. We already gave an example of how we could use that as part of our training, but we'd also like to make it part of our consultations and recommend it in different areas that we work in to make sure that it's part of our processes. In terms of wider application of the tool, it's really looking beyond specialist education. So when we've asked mainstream settings, so primary schools, secondary schools, colleges, we've asked them, would these standards apply to you? And the previous feedback has been yes. So it would be interesting to trial this with mainstream organisations at different levels of education and see if we need to tailor it at all. And in terms of wider application of the techniques, what we've got is an existing knowledge base, and we've got the ability to capture data from those attempting to meet those standards in that knowledge base. There's lots of different scenarios where that could work. An example would be within specialist education, there's a set of guidance called RAPA, and RAPA is around capturing student progress on non-academic courses. So I think there's other areas that we could apply this to. So we'll be finishing soon, and I'd be really interested to see if you could think of times that we could apply this to other areas. And those are the things that we could do to develop the tool. I thought on a bit further about what were the principles that we used when we were looking at this overall, because I think we have ethical responsibilities when using artificial intelligence. So I think there's some considerations. One is that humans are still responsible for the output. So that's why we designed the report to be sent to us, Techability first, so we could look over it before we sent it on. I think it's about using AI to reduce workload in key areas where human input is less valuable, but at the same time increasing human interventions in other areas. So if I'm spending less time writing a report for an organisation, it means that maybe we can plan a meeting where we go through the recommendations together and they bring up any questions or queries that they've got about it. I think we made sure that every request had value. So it's never nice to have. It's actually, these are really important interventions for a college to have. And that's around being aware of the environmental impact of requests. So we're making sure that what we do is valuable. And the final one was the ownership of source materials, to make sure that we're not unethically using other people's materials, that we've got permissions to use the materials that we have. So that was a kind of run through of the Techability Standards and the OU project. I know there's a lot to cover there. But yeah, thanks to everyone involved in it. Thanks to the champions who really helped us give that feedback. Thanks to Open University, who were amazing partners. Everything we threw at them, they came back. And there was a certain point where Richard was developing this and I lost track of what he was doing. It became too complex to me. But yeah, also thanks to Techability. We've got Phil here. Hi, Phil. And the Assistive Technology Network for supporting us. And thanks to everyone involved.